Good evening, everyone. This group quiets quickly. Wow. Good evening, everyone. Welcome. It is my privilege to greet all of you, welcome you to this incredible event that we're sponsoring here tonight. So for those of you I haven't had a chance to meet, which I don't think is many of you, but I'm Tori Bayless and I serve as the CEO for Luminis Health. So with us here this evening are, of course, all of you wonderful team members, community members, leaders, and we have former members and current members of our Board of Trustees, our Arundel Medical Center and Doctors Community Medical Center Foundation boards, current and prior. Thank you for joining us. Members of our leadership team at Luminis Health. We had a big leadership meeting in this room just earlier today. We also want to welcome our community partners. And a couple of just quick shout outs I want to do for some very special team members. I want to recognize our Cultural Diversity Alliance and our African American Employee Resource Group, who were instrumental in pulling this event together. So thank you. Could you please stand, members? Please stand. Thank you. Another person I want to thank and recognize is Dr. Deborah Whitehurst Brown. It has been Thank you. Several months ago, we started talking about the opportunity to have a program like this. And Debbie was like, we're doing this. I'm doing this. We're making this happen. And she absolutely did with friends and colleagues. And we're so glad to have you as a incredible member of our medical staff and in this community for many years. Thank you, Dr. Whitehurst Brown. So we may have some of our elected officials joining as well, but I won't put anyone on the spot to stand or be recognized at this moment. But I do want to say, before I introduce our speakers this evening, I would like to share a little bit more about the Doordan Lecture Series. So this event was dedicated about 13 years ago, almost 14 years ago, by our Board of Trustees at the time of Chip Doordan's retirement after serving almost 40 years here in this community and leading this organization. So it was a pretty momentous occasion when he stepped us away, but he didn't step too far away. He continues to support the organization and serves on our Arundel Medical Center Foundation board. But this leadership is the 6th Martin L. Doordan Leadership Lecture that we have hosted over the past several years. And it really is a true reflection of his legacy and represents leadership and excellence and inspiration. Today, of course, we were also celebrating Juneteenth, and this evening's program really is apropos as we remain committed across all of Luminis Health to our JEDI journey, to our Heart Force recommendations, and to health equity. So madness. This evening, we are honored to present Antonia Hylton, Peabody and Emmy Award-winning news correspondent, in conversation with Luminis Health Trustee Joyce Phillip. Chip, did you stand when I called your name out? I was supposed to say that. Not only is Chip here with us, but his wife Tina and his 2 sons, Sean and Martin. Let's hear it for the entire Doordan family. Sorry about that. He's like, I'm not going to stand. I'm like, you're going to stand. I'm the boss now. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. We have such a great rapport. We can just, cut it up like that. It's a good thing. It's a good thing. So I'm sorry, back to our author and featured guest. So Antonia Hylton, we're so thrilled to have you with us and this conversation with Joyce Phillip as well. Earlier this year, she published the book Madness, Race and Insanity in a Jim Crow Asylum, which has already been recognized as a New York Times bestseller and editor's best pick from Amazon. Madness, I know several of you have already read it. Several of you got the book tonight. Several of you are listening to the book. It is remarkable, and it tells a 93-year history of the state-run Crownsville Hospital, one of the last segregated asylums with surviving records and a campus that still stands to this day quite close by. Many of us drive past it with some regularity. If you have read the book, you know that in addition to Crownsville Hospital being right up the road, There's another connection to us here at Arundel Medical Center. It's mentioned that patients from Crownsville or other Black members of the community were unable to receive care at their local hospital because Arundel Medical Center was segregated until the 1960s. It's an important part of our history that we acknowledge and that we continue to make progress and move forward. While we can be proud of our progress, I think we all know we have additional work to do. At Luminis Health, we are committed to providing patient-centered, culturally competent care for everyone in our community. Our justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion work is a core part of the values throughout the organization. And as we assess and examine outcomes in care and quality, and we continue to move the needle on health equity and reducing healthcare disparities. In the book, Antonia traces the legacy of slavery and the treatment of Black people's bodies and minds to the downstream impact and gaps in behavioral health services. At Luminis Health, many of you know you've supported us through the years. We have made significant investments in the full continuum of behavioral health services on this Annapolis campus, Riva Road campus, Lanham, and even through telehealth and virtual care. So allow me to share just a bit more about our distinguished speakers this evening. Antonio, again, an award-winning NBC News and MSNBC correspondent who has won several awards, including Emmys for education and immigration reporting. She graduated magna cum laude from Harvard University in 2015, where she received recognition and awards for her writing and investigative research on race, mass incarceration, and the history of psychiatry. As a 19-year-old undergraduate, Antonia read an academic paper that mentioned Crownsville Hospital, and that reference really spurred her obsession, if you will, that has carried her through an incredible 10-plus year journey to produce the book Madness. We're also honored to have Luminis Health Trustee Joyce Phillip, who has been a longtime member of this family, as part of this conversation. Joyce earned her nursing degree from Freedman's Hospital School of Nursing and a bachelor's degree in English from Bowie State University. She also holds a master's degree in liberal arts from St. John's College. Joyce's healthcare career began at Crownsville Hospital back in 1967, where she was a nurse manager of the research unit, and her husband, Dr. Errol Phillip, was a psychiatry resident. Dr. Phillip, we're going to ask them to stand, and the kids and the in-laws, we're going to have the whole family stand here. Dr. Phillip has been an esteemed and long-standing member of our community and practiced as a clinician from 1973 to 2016. And he was recognized by his peers and colleagues on this medical staff as with the Community Healer Award. And no description is more fitting. And we're so thrilled to have you with us as well, Dr. Phillip, and daughters and sons-in-law, the family with us here today as well. Thank you for being with us. Please stand up. Back to Joyce. Joyce went on to serve as the Chief Human Resources Officer for 17 years at Arundel Medical Center and later with the University of Maryland Faculty Practice, and is now a Luminis Health Trustee and a very active leader in this community. In the spirit of the Doordan Lecture, our two guests this evening certainly exemplify the ideals of excellence and connectivity to our values and our community. I am very pleased that we are able to come together this evening to have this conversation on Juneteenth, a day that marks the end of slavery in the United States and celebrates freedom, hope, and resilience, themes throughout Madness. So please join me in welcoming. It is my honor to introduce our speakers, Antonia Hylton and Joyce Phillip.
What a way to celebrate Juneteenth. To celebrate Juneteenth in Annapolis, Maryland, this way. You feel it? Yeah. I cannot begin to tell you how honored I am to sit on this platform with you. This author is a member of the Annapolis family. That's the way we feel about her.
Oh, thank you.
On this day, we celebrate the finality of structured slavery in the US. Notice I said structured slavery. It is a day where we celebrate freedom and the long struggle for civil rights, which continues, truth, and giving a voice to the unheard. There's a correlation to Juneteenth and what Antonia writes in this book. Like the residents of Galveston, who knew nothing about the Emancipation Declaration that ended slavery, I worked and lived at Crownsville and never knew its early history. Share with us, Antonia, how you learned about Crownsville and how you came to write this book.
Well, first, Joyce, and can everyone hear me? Well, okay, good. I want to say that it's not just an honor to be on this stage with you, but to have had the opportunity to get to know you, Errol, and your family over these last several years. It truly, I mean, even in the pandemic, just hopping on a Zoom call with you, it brightened my day.
Oh.
And this book, this work would not be possible without families like yours. And I know that's not always easy to talk about your life, your work, your memories, your family, the ups and the downs. And so I can't thank you enough. And every time I see you, I'll thank you all over again.
Oh, thank you.
So I always tell people that this book has two origin stories. The first and easy story to tell you is that I'm 19 years old, I'm in college. I've decided to study the history of psychiatry because I accidentally stumbled into a lecture about it. I didn't know that you could study the history of psychiatry at the time. And I just became obsessed learning about the growth of asylums in Europe and in the United States, and the development of medications and what happened to soldiers returning home from the 2 world wars. But I just kept noticing that there were no Black people. And I knew something was wrong with that because I come from a family with a long history of mental illness. So I knew we had to be somewhere. We must have made some kind of contribution. I know that we were patients because I know patients in my own family. And so I think I just went searching for Crownsville. And when I came across a monograph that mentioned it in just a couple, 2-3 short paragraphs, a light went off, or really like a fire was lit, I think. And when I realized that there were living people connected to the institution, a site, land that I could visit, I knew there was something special here and that I had to keep digging. The other story that I tell people actually goes back to when I was 11 years old. And I am in the kitchen talking to my dad after some of my cousins have come to visit my family. And I'm in a really big family. I'm one of 7 kids and I have like 30-something cousins. So we're all around the kitchen counter. And I asked my dad, well, why don't I know anything about your cousins? And he tells me, well, there's an uncle who you think is your uncle, but he's actually a cousin. A story some of you were probably very familiar with. And then he tells me, well, you know, my favorite cousin growing up, who I was so close to, he was killed by a police officer in the middle of a mental health crisis. He had schizophrenia. None of us really know what happened. And it happened in the 70s and no one wants to talk about it anymore. And I noticed my father's eyes was kind of looking down. He couldn't really look at me. It was very clear to me he didn't want me to ask too many questions about this cousin. And as I got older and I heard more whispers and rumors from people in the family, I could fill in the blanks. And I felt so many emotions: anger, outrage, deep sadness for my dad and my whole family and the trauma that this incident had caused for all of them. And then also just a fear about, well, if this goes unaddressed, what will this do to my dad as he ages? What will this do to my grandparents? What will it do to me and my siblings? And I tried to talk about these things with my parents and they often said no. I remember asking them for a therapist once when I was depressed in high school and they said, oh no, that's just for white people. And that straight up, serious, deadpan, they were like, no, we don't do that. And I was kind of annoyed with them at the time, but I didn't really question it. And I realized that that pain, that disconnect from the healthcare field is personal and historical. And so I think when I think back to where did all this really start for me, when did the snowball start rolling down the hill? I actually think it's that moment. And I am so honored that I had the opportunity to get to know people in this community, to spend a decade coming back and forth. The same time, sometimes I wonder, why didn't somebody beat me to the punch? The hospital closed in 2004. I was in 4th grade. There are plenty of people at the Washington Post and Baltimore Sun who could have called you an arrow, could have reached out to the Belt family, could have gone to Paul Lurz's home. He's a pretty public figure in Annapolis, and they didn't. And so I'm grateful that I could do this, but sometimes it nags at me. It bothers me in a way that I was the one. If that makes sense.
It does make sense. And you're telling us a story that has several origins. And we all wonder why no one told the story, but you did. And that's the value.
Well, one of the things that I discovered in my research, and it's one of the arguments that I make in this book for anyone who hasn't had the chance to read it yet, is that part of what may contribute to the mental strife and pain that so many Black families in this country go through is that often they find themselves feeling in cities like Annapolis, like they live in completely different psychological worlds. Like they drive by a place like Crownsville that everyone sees, everyone has a level of access to, and they see and they feel something that they think their neighbors just don't care about.
There it is.
Okay.
There it is.
But I realize that this is, as much as this is a story about people and a place and Crownsville itself, it's also a very American story about the ways in which one of the things that racism does in this country is that it creates these different sort of psychological pockets, and it allows many white people in this area and many parts of the country to live without having to worry about what happens at places like Crownsville. They don't have to ask the question. They don't have to hear the rumors, and they can grow up and drive past it every day, and that doesn't really strike them. But it's different in the Black community. And so that's part of the story for me of, why did your family hold on to these memories for so long, but some of your neighbors are only finding out about them now? That's part of, I think, the dissonance, the disconnect that I hope this book can bridge.
I often say that whites do not need to know my history, but for me to survive as an executive, as someone that walks the streets of Annapolis or enters anywhere, I need to know their history. I need to know things about them, but they never have to know things about me. And you've just said that. In the introduction of the book, you state, quote, "My wish is that madness will help us understand both our current broken mental health care system and our carceral one," end of quote. Now, I believe you can't fix things unless you know its history. You can't fix things unless you understand what happened at Crownsville. Walk us through the early history, that early history that you wrote so clearly and powerfully about.
Thank you. So Crownsville opens in 1911, but Crownsville as an idea begins many years before that. For years, lawmakers, leaders, and doctors in this state were debating very openly what they should do about a problem that they called the Negro insanity problem. They kept remarking in the papers and in their private letters that they noticed African American communities in Maryland struggling, it seemed, after emancipation, that a lot of them had emotional challenges, some of them had become alcoholics, they would write, and they just couldn't understand why they were having such a hard time. And I appreciate that you laugh at that, because it's one of those things that I laughed at to keep from crying, and at one point, some Northern doctors try to raise the possibility that perhaps hundreds of years of enslavement has caused mental trauma.
I wonder.
And even though it's over, they're still sad about it. And a couple doctors down here are like, no. We think we know what's going on here. They can't handle being free. That's a real argument made in private, in public, in the political sphere and the medical sphere, that Black people were fundamentally different from white people and white patients. And because they were so fundamentally different, they needed to be treated in separate facilities. And those separate facilities would have slightly different practices than your typical asylums around the United States. Not that those were working so well either. But this group, they come together, they decide they're going to invest in a Negro asylum. And they just call it that in the beginning, Maryland's Hospital for the Negro Insane. They later rename it Crownsville. And they get going on it, but they realize they don't really want to pay for it. So they come up with this brilliant idea, which is to find a group of initial patients, all of them men, bring them into the woods and tell them that they are going to build themselves an asylum from the ground up. So they're marched into the woods in modern day Bacon Ridge, so right near where the hospital is now. And they get to work clearing the forest, constructing roads, moving railways, working with electricians and contractors to erect the massive brick structures that are standing more than a century later now. And for me, that always raised these immediate red flags. How could a group of patients be so sick, right, that they need to exit society? They're no longer welcome, but they're so healthy they can do 12-plus-hour shifts building these massive structures that have pretty great bones, apparently. And, the leaders here were very open about this. They celebrated this fact in their writings. They produced a report called the Lunacy Commission Report here. And they would write things like, oh, we put a 10 and 12-year-old boy to work this month. And they would put people who had physical disabilities, who had lost limbs to work. Really no one, unless you truly could not physically participate in labor, was exempt. And this was something that Maryland was quite proud of. And even after the patients then build their own asylum, and it opens up and more patients come in 1912, they then begin to basically turn the place into a plantation. So patients run a massive, highly productive, very modern farm that uses high-level irrigation tactics, unlike the patients at any of the other major state institutions. They have to run a carpentry shop, a rug shop. They have to serve the superintendent, a man named Dr. Robert Winterode, and his top lieutenants their meals 3 times a day. The superintendent has himself made it like a big house. I mean, it looked like a plantation. It talked like a plantation. It walked like a plantation. They were, after deciding that essentially Black people weren't capable of handling freedom, they were recreating the antebellum social order right there on this land. And what I argue in this book is that it's really important for us to grapple with that fact, because you cannot make sense of where we are right now without knowing that. Because every era in this field is built upon the attitudes from that moment. And these aren't just some random fringe figures. These are men who still have their names on buildings and roads here. Marbury Road, the Winter Road building, Hugh Young building. These are people who wrote incredibly racist stuff about Black patients and did not see them as fully human. And they cemented their status not just by putting their names on buildings and publishing in medical journals, by training the doctors who came in, by designing the hospital, by making the decision, for example, to provide less therapy space at Crownsville than they did at other comparable institutions. I mean, these are all decisions that then, when you arrived in the 1960s, they informed your everyday there. Because you got less funding, you had substandard housing and less therapy space to work with your patients. And so I argue that you could say all of that stuff is water under the bridge and it's long ago. But the truth is you were still walking among it. You were still living in it all the way up until 2004. And maybe you'd argue even today.
That is so incredible. I am fascinated also how patients were brought to Crownsville. Can you speak a little bit about that? Because that in itself says something about the state. And segue then into the records.
Oh, yeah. Well, patients in those early days, many of them were just scooped up from poor houses and almshouses. And they would write that they walked into some of these almshouses and found Black men in the basement or in stables with cattle and other farm animals chained to walls. They would pick those men up, bring them to Crownsville, and they would join the construction site to build this asylum. After those early years, they start to come in a whole, manner of ways. So there are families that decide they can no longer afford to take care of a loved one, and they're just dropping adults and infant children off at Crownsville. And Crownsville doesn't really have a plan for what to do about this, so they actually have those small children living on adult wards. One of them is on the front cover of the book. And police eventually get involved in this too. So many of the very first employees, Black employees who got the chance to work at Crownsville, they describe arriving in the 50s and discovering that a lot of the patients they were working with were picked up after stealing food or drinks from a small shop, being found drunk late at night in Baltimore, sort of petty small crimes that then somehow landed them for years in an asylum. I write at one point about a woman named Marie Goff, who is the godmother of somebody in this room. Faye Belt is right there. If you want to wave, Faye. And she comes in and discovers that her own supervisor had picked up a Black man downtown in Baltimore because he had overheard him speaking with a British accent. And he didn't believe there were any Black people in Britain. So he thought this man must be crazy. He's just putting on this accent. So he called the cops, got the guy committed to Crownsville, and he got stuck at Crownsville for decades. And it turns out after Marie Goff, the first Black woman to get the chance to work with him, and she actually starts asking him about his life story, that he had been born in London. He was a jockey who had come to compete in the United States, and he had fallen on hard times. And it's only once she is there and starts to see her own patients as human beings who deserve to have conversation and support that she discovers what her supervisor has done. And the reality that many of the people she was working with and calling patients might not actually have a mental illness, a diagnosis at all.
It's quite strange. You cannot talk about bringing people to Crownsville without talking about the fact that some people were paid to bring people to Crownsville.
That's true. Yes. And this is an interesting part of the research for me. And I learned a lot of lessons as a journalist. So in the early years, when I was 19 years old, just starting to make phone calls on this, I would hear from people who would tell me, oh yeah, they used to pay people $25 to drop someone off at Crownsville. And as a journalist, you're naturally very skeptic. You want someone to show you proof. And they never had proof, so I didn't really pay a whole lot of attention to that, if I'm being honest at first. I just thought, okay, they must not be remembering something right. But then family after family after family kept telling me, no, they would come and they would exchange money when someone would be dropped off at Crownsville. The cops would threaten young boys down at Carr's Beach. I'm going to take you to Crownsville so I can go get $25. And it was people who didn't know each other were repeating the same rumor. And so then eventually as a reporter, you start to think, oh, okay, I guess I'm really gonna have to dig into this and figure out what's going on here. And I never found any record. This wasn't a policy, certainly on the books at Crownsville, but so many people repeated it to me that I felt it was important to include in the book, because what you find in the records is that it's not even half the story. I mean, they would admit people into the institution and not even remember to write down their diagnosis, to take intake notes, to have contact information for their families. And so if they weren't doing that, and I have to go out into the community and trust the oral history to fill in the rest of the story, then if dozens of people in Maryland have a memory of the police and Crownsville operating in this way, then I needed to acknowledge that in the book. And so the overwhelming communal evidence suggests that there was something like that going on.
Fascinating. One of the things that people do not realize is that African Americans were not allowed to work at Crownsville. It was a hospital for the Negro insane, but they could not work there. That in itself created its own share of problems.
Oh, yeah.
There were young children there. We talk about Addie, and I know Addie, the story of Addie is close to your heart. A child who was 3 years old.
Yep.
Couldn't see, couldn't speak. They were placed in the same place as adults. Use your imagination. What do you think happened to many of the people? What happened to Murray? Would you tell that story?
Sure. Well, what I was going to say is that the truth is we don't have to use our imaginations very much. Certainly there are families here still searching for their personal stories and their personal records who have had to fill in the blanks on their own. But we actually know a lot about how patients were treated in those early years, because the state every so often would send grand juries in. They would allow 1 or 2 attorneys in to come take a look at what was going on. And patients found ways to contact Black reporters at places like the Afro-American to try to warn them to, could you just tell a little bit of our side of the story? Could you put this on the front page? And so you start to see as the decades go on in the public record that just the cracks are starting to form and more of the truth is getting out there. To the first part of your question, what we know was happening to children in the first couple decades, that they were living on wards and sometimes forced to sleep near people who were accused sex offenders. We know that many of them reported physical and sexual abuse, both women, girls, and men and boys, at the hands of other patients and also at the hands of white employees at the time. We know that many of them were at times starving. They would run away and try to eat food in the backyards of people who lived near the hospital, who then would, of course, call the police or call on someone in the hospital to have them return. And didn't often question, well, why might this young person be in my backyard eating all my tomatoes? And we know that the conditions were incredibly filthy. And we know this from healthcare workers who are still alive today in their 90s, who went in the 50s and remember seeing feces matted on the floor, hearing their own supervisors say that they refused to clean and sanitize. And so it was quite grim, and we know it. William Murray was the father of decorated civil rights icon Pauli Murray. And very few people know that her father was sent to Crownsville. And I thought it was really important to include his story in the book for a few reasons. I think often when people think about asylums, and especially a segregated Negro asylum, they imagine some of the people from the darkest corners of, they imagine the patients dragged in chains from almshouses. And certainly those stories are really important, and they're true. But William Murray was a Howard graduate. He was a pianist. He was a principal. He dedicated to educating Black children who were barred from the best schools in Baltimore. And he worked around the clock to support his 6 kids and his wife. And that stress and the immense workload that he took on led him to develop a fever. And after he recovered from that fever, his mental health was never the same. And his family really, they didn't have the resources. They didn't know what to do. So eventually they sent him to Crownsville. And within just a few years of his time at Crownsville, he is, reported to have good behavior. He's put to work in the rug shop to produce rugs that offset the cost of his own care. He doesn't get any income from it. But he is murdered by an openly racist white guard in the basement. And there is a really powerful scene in Polly Murray's memoir that I write about in this book, where she comes to see her father for the very last time. And then she sees him after he's been bludgeoned by this man. And her family tries to make a workers' compensation claim because he had been working so regularly in the rug shop, but they're told that he didn't count as a real employee. Again, this is just after these patients have built the whole place. Arguably, they're the only real employees there. And I thought it was important because, of course, it shows you the danger, the dynamic in Crownsville in those early years, but also because it complicates, maybe the average person's view of, well, who is a patient? Who needs help? Who can find themselves in a place like Crownsville? It's not just the most marginalized among us. It is not just the poorest. It is not just the alcoholics. It's not just the physically disabled, though certainly all of those communities are represented there. There are so many stories in the Black community of people actually suffering mentally because they had reached these heights, because they had tried to beat and jump over one hurdle after another, because they'd tried to be something in a country that was trying to tell them they weren't anything. And that's what leads them to a place like Crownsville. And I think it's really important because I think often people who come from those families, there's so much stigma and shame around the perceived failure. And so they don't talk about it. They don't heal from it. They don't know what to do, how to support someone else in their family if they need it. And so I wanted William Murray's story in there for all of those reasons.
I want you to talk a little bit about what it was like when employees desegregated the employee force. There were incredible people that we knew. People like Dr. Vernon Sparks that you mentioned in the book. George Mackenzie Phillips, superintendent, first superintendent, and my husband did his psychiatry under him. Joe Lee, who created a rehabilitation center that they didn't have in other areas. A nurse that helped me, Lulu Sims, she's still living, and I was able to see her the other day. Paul Ertz. So many of these people did not just come to work at Crownsville, but they also shared their support and knowledge with us who came later. We learned from them. There is a paragraph about those early days that I want you to read. It is about Gertrude Bell, Faye's mother. She was a nurse, an incredible person. She shows her love, her empathy, her caring, and the power of touch. And that portion of the book brought tears to my eyes. Because when we came from Michigan to Crownsville, she showed us that same love, that same caring. And that is the power of having people who see others as human beings can make and change lives. So would you do?
I've got it ready right here for you. This is one of my favorite parts of the book too. This is on page 115. In Gertrude's view, and she's talking about the patients here, she's talking about the white employees, sorry. In Gertrude's view, they didn't seem to understand or like the patients and often avoided coming close to them. The previous hiring system at Crownsville had allowed white candidates to benefit from a less competitive applicant pool and process. Many had little more than a high school education. Black nurses and doctors like Vernon Sparks, on the other hand, typically competed for a handful of spots, and many of them had multiple degrees. Every few days, Gertrude would sit her patients down on the floor between her legs. She would squeeze them in between her knees as she shampooed their hair and carefully combed their curls out. When she finished, Gertrude would mop and scrub the floors by herself. It was a hospital, but her manager had not hired professional cleaning and sanitation staff. In the 1960s, her close friend Dorothea McCullers, a talented seamstress, came to work at Crownsville too. The two women would try to find or make the best clothing they could, and Dorothea would fix tattered linens and make custom items for patients in need. The women were often the primary breadwinners in their families.
Can you imagine these women and these men coming to work at Crownsville? Everybody else is white. They're Black. What did they face?
A lot. And it's this period of integration it's a rich part of the book because it's a messy part of the book. There are white staff members there who are extremely resistant and openly resistant to having to deal with integration. And their sort of attitudes and actions range from open and overt racism and slurs to just icing their colleagues out. So I write at one point about a nurse who describes going to go get lunch and then overhearing a white woman that she works with saying to a friend that she wishes Crownsville would go back to the way that it was. And so they were lonely often in those early years because of that hostility and isolation. But it was also very politically messy. There was a power struggle between the white staff there who'd been there first and they felt they knew the place, they ran the place, they owned the place, new Black staff members who in many cases were very young. So, some of them, like Vernon Sparks, had served in World War II and had a whole life behind him. Others were 18 and 19 years old and coming in as aides. This was their first professional experience. They didn't know how to challenge a supervisor who said something they didn't agree with. What were they going to do if they saw a patient get abused? This was their first job. And they'd basically been told in so many words and ways that you're lucky to be here. We barely wanted to let you in the door. So you could lose this job if you kind of don't get with the program. And then beneath them on that totem pole, of course, the patients who have the least power and are at times looking for ways to take some power back or to find an ally who will support them. And so there's this constant kind of push and pull between all these groups. And it can make for really devastating outcomes, sometimes hilarious outcomes even. But there's one story in the 80s, so well after integration had started, that I often kind of chuckle about that Dr. Brian Sims told me. He's a psychiatrist who came to work at Crownsville in the 80s. And he described that one day all the doctors and nurses are forced to watch this training video about what to do when patients on the ward become violent and how you're going to take them down in groups of 2 or 4. And so they're all standing there watching what he described as a pretty crappy, low budget, poorly acted film in which some nurse somewhere else is pretending to be a patient. And it's doesn't well reflect real life. Little do they know, the patients are actually behind them watching this film with them at the very same time. And the second the film is over, one of the patients starts to reenact a scene from the film. And man, when he was telling me this story, the two of us were rolling because it is just so funny. And I hope I captured it the way that he told it to me, because I still chuckle all the time when I think about it. And this teenage boy manages to make a fool of all the nurses and doctors there on the ward. And he basically is sending them a signal of like, you think you know more about me than I know about me, and have some humility. And I love that because it's for so many patients who felt so downtrodden and beaten down, finding those moments where they could show all those people, like, I know what's going on here. I also think all the time about another patient who I call Ramona in the book, who knew a lot of people who worked at Crownsville. The way that she kind of had like a network of spies at the institution. She knew what was happening everywhere, even when she was in seclusion. And she would shout messages to people out windows. And at one point, she escaped out onto the roof. And one of the nurses who was terrified of heights had to go out on the roof, try to rescue this patient, but the patient ends up having to rescue her because she's too scared to actually do anything. So it's those moments that I was so glad to include in the book because they make you laugh. They're so human. But also you see the way in which sort of every day on this job, these people in all of these different roles are fighting for their humanity, are fighting for their perceived space and place in this system. Crownsville becomes so reflective of the same tensions and challenges playing out in our country, in our society at large. And I think that is a messy, heartbreaking, and a beautiful thing.
I want to spend just a few moments describing what it was like to arrive at Crownsville. When we arrived at Crownsville, we arrived at a community, in a community. It's not the Crownsville of the early 50s. Patients walked the yards, the grounds. There were ball games. I always like to tell one story, and my daughter probably would wish I didn't tell it. But it shows how open it was. I lived in cottage number 3. Still exists. It's falling apart and it breaks my heart to see it. But one day, it was a morning, a patient walks into my house, grabs Monia, who is about, I'd say about 14 months old, sits down and starts to explain that this is her child. Now, you would think, oh my God, what would I do? But it was Crownsville. I sat down with her and talked about her baby, hoping to get her back. The patient talked about her and how she came to be and gave her a name. And I'm thinking, oh boy, this is going to go on for a while. Monia started to cry. And I picked up Monia. I went over to her and said, could I change the baby's diaper for you? And she said, yes, and handed me Monia. I tell that story because when we think of mental illness, we get fearful. And there are some people, the criminally insane, that are truly identified of that we should be concerned about. But at Crownsville, there was this community of people who walked the grounds, patients who eventually were able to get the care, but had nowhere to go. She didn't harm Monia. Monia's there. I walked out of the house with Monia and didn't run, just went and told someone what had happened. And the patient walked out gently, and that was it. It's how you view mental illness. That same community, Faye babysat for my children, was extended to the employees. My husband was a table tennis champion. The cafeteria was a place where we all met together and talked about things, and there were baseball games and so forth. I'm trying to describe what Crownsville was. It was not a scary place. It was a place that finally was about healing.
Well, not to dampen that, because that is a very, it's a rich part of the book, and it makes up a lot of the book, is the way in which the Black community comes in and starts to transform the institution. Mm-hmm. But what I also think is really important, Gertrude Bell is transforming the experience on wards. There is suddenly a Black superintendent. That's the same exact moment, coincidentally, that state lawmakers start to pull back some of their support for Crownsville. Mm-hmm. They start fighting a lot more over funding. There start to be rumors and whispers that Crownsville is going to need to shut down. Black employees start describing how they would be so proud of themselves because they would start a new program when there were problems with the patients, when there was violence, when there were riots on wards. So they couldn't win. And so people started to describe this goalpost that just starts moving and moving around the moment the hospital starts to reflect its own community. And so I think that's important because you see this community kind of break this glass ceiling, but then find out there's like another layer of glass right above that one. And that the lawmakers who they thought they were, that they were playing a game with a certain set of rules with, we're never going to honor.
That is heartbreaking. But it's the reality when you live in a world where there is systemic racism, not only in schools, but in hospitals and in healthcare. And it creates the disparity, healthcare disparities. And we do have a lot of work to continue to do. I want to take a different path right now.
Uh-oh.
You stepped and out, did something most journalists would not do. You talked about your own family and how that impacted you and your family. Would you speak a little bit about that?
Absolutely. I want to make sure the mic is working. I made the decision to write a bit about my family after I had already started the book. I started to wonder and talk with my editor about what it would mean to write a book like this for a national audience and to ask people to trust a relatively young journalist on the topic. Well, why would you want to read what I have to say about Crownsville? Why would you be interested in following a journalist on this journey? And the answer that I just kept going back to was, well, I come from a family of lived experience. I know what it's like to fight day after day to get a loved one connected to a community mental health resource. To be told that your loved one's going to wait on an 8-month waiting list before they're going to get any support. Oh, thank you. No need to apologize. Thank you. And that pain, it was a lot of what was propelling me in the writing. I think you could feel it on some of the pages that I'm sort of publicly mourning with you. And so I needed to be honest with the reader. And at first I was very nervous about that, but then I remembered the fact that as a journalist, you're always honest with your readers. If I were a business journalist and my family owned a chain of expensive restaurants, I would need to tell you that because you should know that my family has a stake in what I'm writing about. And the same applies here. You should know that I'm not just a neutral observer of this topic. I'm writing from a place of personal pain. So I opened the book. The introduction is, it takes place in a park that I spent a lot of time in my childhood, and then again in the pandemic, because I had a loved one going through a mental health crisis. They were experiencing psychosis, and the pandemic was making it impossible for us to get this person support. So I would go to this park, and it was our meeting place. We would go on these walks, and I would try to do everything I could to help them through this, but I was panicking, and me and much of my family, we felt really lost. And so I write about this experience in this park and what the park comes to mean for me as sort of a metaphor for the way in which families are kind of forever changed when someone goes through something like that, and how you start to feel like someone you're so intimately tied to, who you feel like you know everything about, they're starting to live on another planet. And the only way for us to reconnect was to put our 2 feet in the same park. And so I tried to write, to begin the book in that place, so that people who come from families like mine would maybe see that and take something familiar from it and feel like, okay, I can walk hand in hand with this person on a story as difficult as this one. I can deal with the history of Crownsville. I can meet the many people I'm about to meet. I can go from 1911 to 2004 with this person because they've been somewhere I've been. And it felt a little bit like a risk. But I'll tell you that now that the book has been out there for several months, I've received a lot of notes from readers who are very grateful for that, who have felt like they didn't know where they were going to find that. And it was cathartic for me. The other really wonderful thing about this book, aside from just getting to be in community with people like all of you, is that it's inspired a lot of members of my family to go get help for the first time, to seek therapy and psychiatric support if they need it. During the pandemic, we did a weekly family Zoom where we would spend hours just talking about how everyone is doing and what we could do to help each other out. And now that that's over, I go back home all the time to check on my loved ones. And so it's really just changed the way that my family interacts. And, you know, that is just the greatest gift.
When I sat down to read this book, I could only read a few chapters at a time because it was full of pain and injustice. It moved into community building, resilience, overcome, and above all, it moves towards hope. I know that we want to get some questions from the audience, but I hope you can briefly tell us what you think should be the next steps.
Well, you know, the thing that I try to tell people, this is a room of, I hope it's okay for me to say experts. I think you know more than I do in this space. So in some ways, this is the best room to give advice and the worst room to give advice, because I feel like I'm going to go around and ask all of you to help me and my family out when this is over. But this is what I tell people, especially young people who reach out to me or when I do events at schools. Mental health is everything. And what I mean by that is it's a lot more than just, say, supporting one bill about funding one program or asking for a clinic to open up in one neighborhood, or, you know, creating meditation apps and telling people to solve their own problems by sitting in their room and listening to some things they can go to sleep better. That's all fine, but those are sort of individualized solutions to a communal problem. And mental health is everything. It is good quality public schools. It is good quality public space and parks. It is safety and security. It is seeing yourself in every space in which you need to see yourself. So if you're a child, that might mean books that reflect you and your experience. It might mean having mentors and teachers and people around you who show you a path to success and make you feel like you matter. It means having relationships with adults in your life that you trust. And so I try to tell people when they feel lost, well, one of the first things you can do is you can wake up tomorrow and be a better aunt or uncle to a niece or nephew who's maybe having trouble and maybe they can't talk to their mom about something they're going through, but maybe they'll talk to you. So why don't you give them a phone call? Or if you know that your friend is having a hard time and they don't have a family that's supporting them, how can you step in? What can you do to just be a better friend or sibling or elder to somebody? Just those small acts will make you feel a little bit better about, I think, the anxiety we all feel about this issue right now. I think we're in this really strange moment where people are talking more and more publicly about mental health. But again, people keep trying to push it just back on you. You go find yourself a therapist. Oh, I'm sorry, there's a wait list or no one's available in your city. But keep looking. That's what people hear in New York all the time. Oh, just keep calling. Oh, have you heard about this app? If you pay $10.99 a month, you can do this and that. Seriously, these are the solutions. I mean, I work for NBC News. They offer us all kinds of meditation apps and this and that because you're dealing with stress on the job. Well, the thing that's actually causing the stress isn't the fact that I didn't have this app on my phone. And so, you know, And again, I'm not knocking the people who are trying in the midst of all this to just give us something. But the level of public discourse and desire and anxiety out there, it's not being met by services and available beds and support reimbursement and the money and a diverse enough workforce. You know, I think that it's pretty terrible for all of us, but it's especially terrible if you are a low-income American or a person of color. Mm-hmm. And so I try to tell people to look for leaders at the local level and national level who are supporting the kinds of things that would bolster mental health, community health, well-being, green space, good education, the basic fundamentals to people being able to thrive and be happy in their day-to-day lives, and then find small ways for you to take very personal, direct action to love on the people who are right in front of you. On one side of my family, I'm African American, and on the other side, I'm Afro-Cuban. And on the Cuban side of my family, there's a story that a lot of people in the Caribbean like to tell that I write about actually at one point in the book. It's called the Starfish Story. And I would hear my grandparents and I would hear one of my aunts love to repeat this story. And she would tell us there was a little boy walking on the beach after a terrible storm. And he gets to the beach and he sees thousands and thousands of starfish are washed up on the sand and they're drying out, they're dying. And so he starts to just walk on the beach and pick up a starfish, throw it back in the water, pick up a starfish, throw it back in the water. And a guy comes out and is kind of laughing at the kid and is like, you're going to be here all day. You're never going to get this done. You can't save all these starfish. Just give it up. And the boy looks at the guy. He looks down at the starfish, picks one more up, throws it right back in the water and says, well, it matters for that one. And that's something my family raised me and all my siblings to think about. Try to look at, well, who needs help right in front of your own feet? Yes, you'll get overwhelmed and you'll become, sort of numb to the problems of the world if you look out all over the beach and you are overwhelmed by the starfish. But if you just realize you have the energy and the time right now to lean down and pick up one, that's kind of how you keep going in this life. Mm-hmm. And I'm so glad that I learned that lesson. And I think that you live that lesson every single day. I know that Faye lives that lesson every single day. I know that so many people here do, because that's why you work in this extremely challenging space. We don't do work like this because we're all getting paid the big bucks and we're all, trying to make it home by 4:30 and
you don't get home by
we do it because we're really moved to a calling and we love and care about our community. That's fundamentally what drives people like all of us to do this. And so you just have to keep picking up the starfish you can. That's what I tell people.
I like that story.
Yeah.
Antonia, having you here and sharing so many beautiful, painful, difficult stories has been something that I will remember, because we all need to hear what is going on. What can we do? And so I would like us to hear, before we start the questions, the Executive Medical Director of Behavioral Health at Luminis Health. And also hear from Davion Percy, who is the Vice President of Community Relations and Public Policy at Luminis Health and Executive Sponsor of the Luminis Health African American Business Research Group. I need to say something. I was always proud to work for Anne Arundel Medical Center. Why? Because they stepped out of their box and would do things that other organizations would not do. The other organizations would think of the money first. And I could always, in orientation, tell employees while I was proud. So I would like if Dr. Leah Jones would You have, oh, good, you have a mic.
So good evening. And first of all, I just want to thank you, Antonia, for being. Should I come to the front? I'm sorry.
Yes, please do, 'cause we can't hear you well.
Thank you so much for being here. I heard you speak when you went to Indian Creek High School, well, Indian Creek School, and I was I said we have to get her here as well. So I'm just so grateful that you took the time to join us on today. I want to thank you for all your service to Crownsville and to the community there. I trained at the University of Maryland in psychiatry, and I heard about the things that had happened at Crownsville, and everyone said you really need to look into the history of Crownsville. And to be honest with you, can you hear me? I didn't want to hear another sad story. I didn't want to hear another bad story about my people and how mistreated they were. And so I, like many, just buried my head into the sand, got my work done, did my training, learned how to take the best care of people that I could so that I could make a contribution to the community. I just greatly appreciate your book because you forced me to pull my head out of the sand about what happened at Crownsville and recognize that in essence what was created was the same sort of system that was happening with the prisons in the South and sharecropping. It's kind of the same thing that was happening, but on the mental health scale. So when you look at Luminis, and I'm here, you asked me what's going on at Luminis. Luminis is a very special organization. Luminis Health is a special organization because Luminis is also not putting their head in the ground and really is trying to be very forward looking and direct and trying to confront the challenges of mental health in our communities in Anne Arundel and Prince George's County. And when you talk about the challenges of accessing care, one of the things that we're doing that we've done that I think is very special and important, and it's a concept that's spreading across the country. We were not the first to do it, but creating behavioral health walk-in environments. And so we have a walk-in program down on the campus of Doctors Community Hospital, where when we try to let people know, you don't have to know the answers. You don't have to know how to get connected. All you have to know is that you need and you want help. And we're here to make sure that you have the help. What we confront is we continue to confront the stigma in our communities. And so we have a program that's open Monday through Friday, 8 to 5 o'clock in the evenings, and one person comes in a day or two people on another day. Sometimes we'll have a good day and have 5 or 6 days. I'm sorry, Mitch. I'm telling the numbers because we don't see the community has this need. The community has the demand. We as a people continue to struggle with our fear about what it is to have a mental health condition and what it means to access the mental health system. So I appreciate that you're seeing the impact in your family. And I hope that we can continue to do what we need to do to combat the stigma that keeps so many people away from the help and the care that they need. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so
Dr.
much.
Jones. Is Davion nearby? There you are, Davion. Hi.
Can you hear me? Yes. Davion Percy, Vice President of Community Relations and Public Policy, and I have the honor of being the executive sponsor of the African American Business Resource Group. As we talk about Crownsville and facilities like Crownsville that existed that treated Black and brown people, particularly Black people, poorly, what do you think are the residual impacts of institutions like that existed on the Black community today?
I think there are a few. I think that places like Crownsville are in part responsible for the level of stigma, shame, and disconnect that you see in communities of color. And that's not just me making my best educated guess. When I have spent time with Black families in the area here, in the DMV area, who have some connection to Crownsville, often I hear people say, we saw Crownsville as an incredibly shameful place. We heard horror stories. Some people in my family went to work there because they needed a job, but people would make fun of kids who were sent to Crownsville. They would use it as a threat if you were not behaving right in school or in the neighborhood. And so Crownsville was in a way used to perpetuate this idea that mental health or psychiatric care is unsafe for Black people, that Black people are fundamentally not welcome in those spaces. And then, you can see it even in the historical record in newspapers. As Black reporters would finally get access to Black patients at Crownsville, and they would try to get their stories about the abuse they were facing inside. It sort of became this feedback loop. And in a way, it's a justified feedback loop. When people ask me about it, I say that one of the reasons this history is so important is because I think if you're working in the healthcare space today, you need to know it, because you are not going to be able to bridge relationships with communities that are resistant, that are angry, if you don't have some understanding and respect for what the people who, honestly, not even that long ago, were doing in some of these spaces. And so, without that information, without that acknowledgement, it's really hard to move forward. I think often people want to just say, oh, it was the Tuskegee syphilis study. And then, oh yeah, we treated Henrietta Lacks bad. But Henrietta Lacks is this sort of singular example, but that's actually representative of what was a pattern. And it was such a bad pattern that while Henrietta's cells were being taken at Johns Hopkins, her daughter was being abused at Crownsville and used in a scientific experiment at Crownsville. It happened twice in one family. So that should tell you about then what Black families were feeling about these spaces. And so I think that's probably the biggest one. I think there are other ones as well that are more systemic and structural too. So, one of the arguments I make in the back half of the book is that, when we deinstitutionalized asylums across the board, the experience of deinstitutionalization was different for Black patients. And we found this in Maryland state records. They did a comparative study between what happened at Rosewood, a majority white institution, and what happened to patients at Crownsville. And they found that at the meetings for the release of Crownsville patients, there were parole officers, police officers, there were members of the court. And at Rosewood, the same age group of patients, they had teachers, vocational trainers, they had people who were preparing to welcome them to community. Whereas there was a lot more of a sort of criminal justice-minded approach to people coming out of Crownsville. And so deinstitutionalization was not experienced by all patients in the same way. Race played a major role in that. And, I spoke to former Crownsville employees who have memories of seeing their own patients suffering outside on the road. And knowing that many of their patients to this day are struggling with homelessness or housing insecurity. And so, I think everyone's sort of familiar with this story of the asylum shutting down and the relics of this past. But very few people talk about the fact that a certain segment of our country has a sort of different layer and different level of disadvantage when trying to access this care. You all know this, but I don't know that more broadly all our neighbors are aware of it.
Thank you. Thank you. And any other questions? Then.
Someone's right there.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much. Can you give us an idea of where the medical field was in general with mental health at those times? Like, was there a DSM manual then? And then secondly, how do you feel that the Crownsville Hospital advanced and contributed to mental health practice today?
I'll do that in reverse order. So I'll answer your last question first. Well, one of the things I love to tell people is that the rehabilitation and recreation department at Crownsville was really transformative, and that groups at other hospitals like Spring Grove and Springfield would come to Crownsville to observe what essentially was really almost like a family business that they were running on Crownsville's property. Started by a man named Joe Lee, and then in many ways led by a man named T. Arthur. And his family there. And they started just testing different things out, having pageants and talent shows for patients, taking them camping out in the woods, teaching them how to swim at the beach in the summertime, and then having dance therapy and sort of creating a much more structured sort of therapeutic environment around the activities they found patients really responded to and enjoyed. They had choirs, patients would sing and perform. I heard from employees who would describe working with patients who really couldn't talk in talk therapy, but who really flourished once someone pulled out a piano and gave them the chance to sing a little bit. And so they were kind of throwing everything at the wall in this place called the Campanella Building that still stands in Crownsville. And they were pioneers in so many ways. And people were ripping off their work and they didn't get a lot of credit for it at the time. So that's one very clear example. And then the other part of your question, the state of mental health care across the board in those early years was abysmal. And so this book certainly doesn't make it sound like at all the other state mental institutions, they had everything about the care of and the treatment of mental illness figured out, and the facilities were a 5-star hotel. But what I am able to demonstrate through the records and writings of state officials here, this isn't me making a guess again, this is what's admitted in the record, was that while all the hospitals were struggling, Crownsville was consistently behind all of the rest, receiving less money than the rest, getting fewer renovations and updates. The patients were expected to offset the cost of their own care to an extent that no other patient population was forced to do. That begins to change in the 50s and 60s as integration comes, and they're no longer allowed to simply force their patients to work 12 hours a day. But I argue that if you've decided to you've treated an institution so differently for decades, and it has been underfunded for so long, just because you stop doing that one day doesn't mean you've made up for 40 or 50 years of doing so wrong. And so what happens to Crownsville employees, like some of the people in this room, is that they are asked to meet the same standards as everyone else, but they are constantly playing catch up. And that's part of what I meant earlier when I said the goalposts are moving, and why it's so important I break the book up into 5 different eras, because I think you need to understand one era before you move on to the next and kind of build them up like blocks, if that makes sense.
Someone else. Sure.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Yes.
Hello, everyone. My name is Faye. I just want to say something about the future since we get ready to close. I think it's very important. And thank you, the dreamer, the visionary, because without you, Crowns would not be in existing and no one know that we existed. Also, I thank Dr. Phillips. I thank Joyce. All through the years, we are still working together. We are the Crownsville Caretakers United. We are working with and accepted, and they're listening because they're listening to the people at Crownsville. And we're making the difference and making the suggestions with Anne Arundel County Planning and Zoning, and Arundel County Recreation and Parks. Also with Stuart Pittman, also with Collective Design. And as we go forth with the Wellness Committee, we're giving them our opinions of what we think that is needed as we meet to continue what we are talking about for the future of helping our community.
Thank you so much, Faye. And I'll take this opportunity to shout out. I've shouted you out several times already, Faye, but shouting you out again, and Dr. Whitehurst Brown for inviting me and making this so possible, and just welcoming me at every single stop and event here in Maryland. It's been so special to have you here in the crowd. But I should have mentioned that the county is working to rehabilitate this land and turn it into a real community mental health resource. I'm sure most of you are aware of this, but you're the experts, so you should go to some of the public open meetings and say say what's on your mind, because a lot of other people are. And I'm not sure how much they know about the history, how much they know about the care that's needed in this community. So certainly you all would be very welcome in those spaces.
Yes. How many of you know Deneen Richmond? Deneen is president of Luminis Health Doctors Community Medical Center and Chief Quality and Equity and Population Health Officer. I am so glad that you're here with us this evening, and we'll close this out. But before you do,
Yes.
I need to say to my friend here, my sister friend, thank you.
Thank you. And thank you to everyone here. Thank you so much.
Yeah, she's sorry. I didn't mean to take anything away from her, but I had to say this to her. Okay?
You actually saved me from saying it, but I'm going to say it again at the end anyway. So, first of all, tonight has been so powerful.
Yes, yes.
Oh my God. And we talked about, and I thank you so much, Antonio, and just sharing, your story and sharing and doing the research to share this powerful story with us. The anger, the sadness, the trauma, those funny moments that we can find even in the midst of all of that. And so I just want to share just a couple of things because we want to wrap up here. And I want you all to think about a few key dates. So June 19th, 1865, the effective end of structural, thank you, Joyce, slavery in the United States. June 17th, 2021, when President Biden signed the Juneteenth National Independence Day Act into law, making today, Juneteenth, a federal holiday, from 1865 to 2021.
Mm-hmm.
And in between those dates, from 1911 to 2004, as we heard, was when Crownsville was opened and then closed. And I want to leave you with one more date as we tie this all together. June 19th, 2024, today.
Mm-hmm.
This has just been an historic evening. And this is a day that will be in the Luminis Health history books. Thank you. So we know that Crownsville and this history that we're hearing, that we're learning, is just a slither of what has happened in the lives of many people of color. However, we also heard our beloved author here, Antonia's sister friend, I love Joyce's term there, say to us, she started off by sharing that how the fire was lit in her. Mm-hmm. So I want to end by saying that I hope that today is lighting a fire in all of us, because we know that we still have work to do. And we've heard that whether it's in mental health, and eradicating disparities, eradicating structural racism, all of those things that exist today. So I'm going to end with a quote that I think just ties it all together from one of my favorite people, Maya Angelou. Mm-hmm. And I know some of you know what I'm getting ready to say. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You do the best you can until you know better. Then when you know better, you have to do better. So I'm asking all of you to join me in making a commitment, both personal and professional, and whatever your profession is, that we will light that fire, keep it lit, and do better. Yeah. And so in closing, I would just ask again that we give a standing ovation to Joyce Phillip for her awesome facilitation tonight, and Antonia Hylton. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I'm getting emotional. Thank you so much.